September 490 BC. 26 miles northeast of Athens, the coastal plain of Marathon stretched beneath a cloudless Mediterranean sky, a flat expanse of earth that would soon be soaked in blood. On one side of this killing ground stood roughly 11,000 Greek hoplites, citizen soldiers from Athens and their loyal allies from tiny Plataea. On the other side, perhaps 25,000 Persian infantry, the vanguard of an empire that stretched from Egypt to India, from the shores of the Aegean to the steppes of Central Asia. The Greeks shouldn't have had a chance. They were outnumbered more than 2 to 1, facing professional soldiers from the most powerful military force the world had ever seen. An empire that had crushed every opponent it had faced, that had subjugated nations and toppled kingdoms, that commanded resources beyond Greek comprehension. Yet in the hours that followed, these amateur soldiers, men who worked as farmers and merchants and artisans when they weren't fighting, would achieve one of the most improbable victories in military history. They would prove that the mighty Persian Empire could bleed, that its armies could be defeated, that the seemingly inevitable conquest of Greece could be stopped. They would change the course of Western civilization in an afternoon of brutal, hand-to-hand combat. And they would do it through a combination of tactical brilliance, physical courage, and the simple fact that free men fighting for their homes possessed something that mercenaries and conscripts could never match. This is the story of how a small Greek army met the Persian war machine at Marathon, and how that collision of civilizations echoed through history for the next 2,500 years. To understand Marathon, you have to understand how the Greeks and Persians ended up facing each other on that coastal plain. The roots of the conflict stretched back to 499 BC, 11 years before Marathon, when the Greek cities of Ionia on the coast of Asia Minor rose in rebellion against Persian rule. These were Greek settlements that had been conquered by Persia decades earlier, forced to pay tribute and accept Persian-appointed tyrants as their rulers. The Ionians had finally had enough. They killed their tyrants, declared independence, and appealed to the Greek mainland for help. Most Greek city-states ignored the plea. They were too busy fighting each other, too absorbed in their own petty rivalries, too afraid of Persian power. But Athens sent 20 warships to support the rebellion. The city of Eretria sent 5. It seemed like a gesture more than anything else, a token of solidarity that wouldn't change the strategic balance. But those 25 ships would prove monumentally expensive. The Athenian and Eretrian forces joined the Ionian rebels in an audacious raid deep into Persian territory. They marched inland from the coast and attacked Sardis, the Persian administrative centre for the western satrapies. The city burned. Persian prestige suffered a humiliating blow, and King Darius I, ruler of the Achaemenid Empire, swore vengeance. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, Darius was so enraged by Athenian interference that he ordered one of his servants to repeat the words, "Master, remember the Athenians 3 times before every meal." Whether or not this story is true, the sentiment was genuine. The Persian king had been embarrassed by a collection of Greek city-states that he viewed as insignificant. The raid on Sardis wasn't just a military setback, it was an insult to Persian honour, a challenge to the aura of invincibility that held the empire together. Darius couldn't let it stand. If Athens could burn a Persian city and get away with it, others might be inspired to rebel. The empire's western frontier would dissolve into chaos. No, Athens had to be punished. Publicly, decisively. And the punishment had to be so severe that no one would dare challenge Persian authority again. The Ionian revolt was crushed by 494 BC. The Persian navy destroyed the Ionian fleet at the Battle of Lade, and Persian armies systematically reconquered the rebel cities. Miletus, the heart of the rebellion, was sacked. Its men were killed, its women and children sold into slavery, its temples burned to the ground. The Persians wanted to send a message about the price of defiance. With Ionia pacified, Darius turned his attention west. In 492 BC, he sent his son-in-law Mardonius with a large army to re-establish Persian control over Thrace and Macedonia. The campaign was successful on land, but the Persian fleet was wrecked in a storm off Mount Athos. Hundreds of ships were destroyed, thousands of men drowned. The expedition was abandoned, but Darius wasn't finished. In 491 BC, he sent ambassadors throughout Greece demanding earth and water, the traditional symbols of submission to Persian authority. Many Greek states complied, They understood the math. Persia was enormous, powerful, seemingly unstoppable. Resistance was suicide. Better to bend the knee and hope for favourable terms. But Athens and Sparta refused. Not only refused, but threw the Persian ambassadors into pits to die. A deliberate and shocking violation of diplomatic immunity that announced to the world that Greece would not submit without a fight. Darius now had his justification for full-scale invasion. Athens had interfered in Persian affairs by supporting the Ionian revolt. Athens had insulted Persian honour by burning Sardis, and now Athens had murdered Persian ambassadors. The city had to be destroyed, its democracy crushed, its people enslaved, and Darius knew exactly who to install as ruler of the conquered city, a man who understood Athens intimately, who had connections among its aristocracy, who had reason to hate the democracy that had driven him into exile. Hippias, the former tyrant of Athens, who had ruled the city until being overthrown 20 years earlier. Hippias would sail with the Persian fleet ready to reclaim his throne once Athens fell. In the summer of 490 BC, the Persian expedition set sail. 600 triremes, the warships that dominated ancient naval warfare, packed with soldiers and supplies. The fleet was commanded by Datis, a Median general with extensive military experience, and Artaphernes, nephew of King Darius. Modern historians estimate the Persian force at somewhere between 20 and 30,000 fighting men, though ancient sources give wildly varying numbers. What's certain is that the Persians had numerical superiority and total confidence in victory. They had never lost a major campaign. They had crushed every rebellion, conquered every nation that stood in their way. Why would a few Greek city-states be any different? The Persian strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. The fleet would island hop across the Aegean, subduing the Cyclades and demonstrating Persian power to any Greek still contemplating resistance. Then they would strike at Eretria, Athens' partner in the raid on Sardis, and make an example of the city. Finally, they would land near Athens itself, deploy their overwhelming force, and watch the city surrender or burn. Hippias, who had sailed from Marathon Bay decades earlier when his tyranny collapsed, suggested landing at the same location. The plain of Marathon offered everything the Persians needed. It was close to Athens, only 26 miles away. It had beaches suitable for landing a large fleet. Most importantly, it had open ground perfect for Persian cavalry. The Persian army's deadliest weapon was its mounted archers, fast-moving horsemen who could shower enemy formations with arrows from a safe distance, then retreat before the enemy could retaliate. On the flat plain of Marathon, Persian cavalry would dominate. The Greeks would have nowhere to hide. The campaign began exactly as planned. The Cyclades Islands fell quickly. The Persians sacrificed at the sacred island of Delos, presenting themselves as liberators rather than conquerors, respectful of Greek gods even as they subjugated Greek cities. Then the fleet moved to Euboea and besieged Eretria. The city held out for 6 days before pro-Persian factions inside the walls opened the gates. The Persians poured in. Eretria was systematically destroyed. Temples were burned in retaliation for the burning of Sardis. The surviving population was rounded up to be deported to Persia as slaves. The message was clear. This is what happens to cities that defy the great king. Athens, are you watching? Athens was watching, and Athens was terrified. When news arrived that the Persian fleet had landed at Marathon, the city erupted in panic. The assembly convened in emergency session, 10 generals arguing over what to do. Some urged defending the city walls, waiting out a siege, hoping the Persians would eventually give up and sail away. Others wanted to retreat into the mountains of Attica and wage guerrilla war, but one general, Miltiades, argued for something far more audacious: attack, immediately. Meet the Persians at Marathon before they could advance on Athens. Fight them on ground of Greek choosing before Persian cavalry could ravage the countryside. Miltiades was uniquely qualified to make this argument. Years earlier, he had ruled the Chersonese Peninsula in Thrace as a semi-independent prince under Persian overlordship. He understood how the Persian military operated, had seen their tactics firsthand, knew their strengths and weaknesses. When the Ionian revolt broke out, Miltiades had sided with the rebels, which meant he could never return to Persian-controlled territory. He had fled to Athens just ahead of Persian vengeance. Now he faced them again, and he was convinced that Greek hoplites could beat Persian infantry in close combat. The key was neutralizing Persian advantages in cavalry and archers, forcing a battle where Greek strengths, heavy armor, and long spears and disciplined formations would dominate. Miltiades' proposal was controversial. Half the generals opposed it. The vote was deadlocked at 5-5. The tie was broken by Callimachus, the polemarch, a civilian official who held a vote in military matters. Callimachus sided with Miltiades. Athens would march to Marathon. Before leaving, the Athenians dispatched a professional runner named Phidippides to Sparta with an urgent request for military aid. Phidippides covered roughly 140 miles in about 2 days, an almost superhuman feat of endurance. He arrived during the festival of Carnea, a sacred period when Spartan law forbade military operations. The Spartans agreed to send troops, but not until the full moon, 6 days away. Athens would have to face Persia alone, almost alone. The small city of Plataea, remembering Athenian help during a border dispute years earlier, sent their entire military force to join Athens. About 1,000 men, a gesture that meant everything to Athenian morale. They weren't completely abandoned. Someone else was willing to fight. The combined Athenian and Plataean army, roughly 11,000 hoplites, marched northeast from Athens toward Marathon. They moved quickly, knowing that every hour gave the Persians more time to prepare. The hoplites were citizen soldiers, men who owned enough property to afford their own armor and weapons, who trained periodically but weren't professional warriors. Their equipment was impressive. Each man wore a bronze helmet, bronze breastplate, and bronze greaves protecting his shins. He carried a large round shield called an aspis, made of wood and bronze, heavy enough to double as a weapon in close quarters. His main weapon was a spear 8 to 10 feet long, with an iron point designed to punch through armor and a bronze butt spike for jabbing at downed enemies. At his side hung an iron sword, a backup weapon for when the spear broke in combat. The total weight of this equipment approached 70 pounds. Hoplite, warfare was exhausting, physically demanding work that required strength and endurance. But in close combat, a fully armoured hoplite was almost unstoppable against lighter infantry. The Greeks arrived at Marathon and immediately took up defensive positions at the southern end of the plain, blocking the 2 main passes that led from Marathon toward Athens. Miltiades chose his ground carefully. The Athenian position had mountains on one flank and swamps on the other, terrain that made it impossible for Persian cavalry to outflank the Greek line. If the Persians wanted to march on Athens, they would have to come through the Greek phalanx first, and if the Persians tried to bypass the Greeks and sail directly to Athens, the Athenians could march back overland and arrive before the slower Persian fleet. The Persians were boxed in. They couldn't advance without a fight, and they couldn't retreat without admitting defeat. For several days the 2 armies stared at each other across the plain. Neither side wanted to move first. The Greeks knew that attacking across open ground would expose them to Persian archers. The Persians knew that attacking uphill into prepared Greek positions would be costly. So they waited. The Greeks were buying time, hoping the Spartans would arrive before they had to fight. The Persians were presumably planning their next move, perhaps hoping Greek resolve would crack, perhaps waiting for pro-Persian factions in Athens to open the city gates from inside. What exactly triggered the battle on that September morning remains one of ancient history's great mysteries. Herodotus, our main source, doesn't give a clear explanation. Modern historians have proposed several theories. One possibility is that Persian scouts reported the Spartan army was finally on the march, forcing Datis to attack before Greek reinforcements arrived. Another theory suggests the Persians began re-embarking their cavalry onto ships, planning to sail around the Greek position and attack Athens directly. When Greek scouts noticed the cavalry leaving, Miltiades saw his opportunity and ordered an immediate attack. Without cavalry, the Persian army lost its most devastating weapon. The window for a Greek victory was narrow, but it was open. On the morning of the battle, probably around dawn, Miltiades formed his army for combat, and here is where his tactical genius became apparent. Greek armies traditionally fought in a phalanx formation, a rectangular block of men standing shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, spears projecting forward. The standard depth was 8 ranks, enough to give the formation weight and momentum while maintaining cohesion. But Miltiades had a problem. His 11,000 men weren't enough to match the frontage of the Persian line. If he deployed his phalanx normally, the Persians would overlap his flanks and attack from the sides and rear, rolling up the Greek line from the edges. So Miltiades made a radical decision. He thinned his centre to perhaps 4 ranks deep, while reinforcing both wings to maybe 12 ranks. This gave him a line long enough to match the Persian frontage while concentrating his strength on the flanks. It was an enormous gamble. The weak centre would almost certainly break under Persian pressure. If the centre collapsed too quickly before the flanks achieved their breakthrough, the entire Greek army could be destroyed. But Miltiades was betting that his strengthened wings could rout the Persian flanks, then wheel inward and attack the Persian centre from both sides, before his own centre completely disintegrated. It was an early form of double envelopment, the same tactic Hannibal would use to annihilate a Roman army at Cannae 270 years later, and it required perfect timing, perfect discipline, and perfect courage from men who had never attempted anything like it before. When the Greeks were in position, Miltiades gave the order that shocked the Persians: charge at a run. Across nearly a mile of open ground. The Greek phalanx began moving forward, slowly at first to maintain formation, then accelerating to a sprint for the final 200 yards. Herodotus reports that the Persians thought the Greeks had gone mad, charging without cavalry support, without archer cover, running in full armour across an open plain toward a larger army. It was suicide. But it was also brilliant. By running, the Greeks minimised their exposure to Persian arrows. Archers needed time to draw, aim and release. A stationary target at 200 yards could be hit repeatedly. A target sprinting at full speed had seconds of vulnerability. Many arrows were fired, but most missed or glanced off bronze armour. By the time the Persian archers could inflict serious damage, the Greeks were among them. The collision was catastrophic. Greek hoplites smashed into Persian infantry like an avalanche. The Persians were skilled fighters, professionals who had conquered half the known world. But they weren't equipped or trained for this kind of combat. Their armour was lighter, mostly wicker shields and fabric or leather protection. Their spears were shorter, their formations were looser, designed for mobility rather than shock action. Against the massed weight of Greek hoplites, they simply couldn't hold. On both flanks, the reinforced Greek wings shattered the Persian line. Bronze armour absorbed Persian spears. Greek shields deflected Persian strikes, and the long Greek spears found flesh again and again, punching through light armour, impaling men, creating gaps in the Persian formation that the Greeks exploited ruthlessly. But in the centre, exactly as Miltiades had predicted, the weakened Greek line gave way. The Persian centre was where the elite troops fought, possibly including elements of the famous Immortals, the royal guard of 10,000 warriors who formed the professional corps of the Persian army. These men were better equipped and better trained than the conscripts on the flanks. They recognized the weakness in the Greek centre and attacked ferociously. The thin Greek line bent, then broke. The centre ranks began falling back, fighting as they retreated, trying desperately to maintain some cohesion as the Persians pressed forward. For a terrifying moment, the battle hung in the balance. If the Greek wings pursued the fleeing Persian flanks instead of turning inward, the Greek centre would be destroyed and the battle lost. If the Persian centre pushed too far forward too quickly, they might break through before the Greek wings could respond. Everything depended on discipline, on the Greek commanders maintaining control over men whose blood was up, whose instinct was to chase fleeing enemies. But Miltiades and his fellow generals held their formations together. As the Persian flanks dissolved, the victorious Greek wings wheeled inward, attacking the Persian centre from both sides simultaneously. The Persian infantry suddenly found themselves surrounded, Greeks pressing in from 3 directions, shields locked, spears thrusting, nowhere to retreat. The Persian centre tried to hold, tried to fight their way out, but the mathematics of encirclement are brutal. Men in the middle of a surrounded formation can't fight because their comrades are in the way. Casualties mount, formation disintegrates, panic spreads. The Persian centre broke. Soldiers threw down their weapons and ran for the ships. The Greeks pursued, killing as they ran, turning an orderly retreat into a rout. Persians trampled each other trying to reach the boats. Sailors pushed off before the ships were fully loaded, stranding hundreds of men on the beach. The water turned red. According to Herodotus, the Athenians lost 192 men in the battle. The Persians lost 6,400. Modern historians debate these numbers. Ancient casualty figures are notoriously unreliable, often exaggerated for propaganda purposes. But even if we halve the Persian losses and double the Greek losses, the outcome is the same, a catastrophic Persian defeat. A victory that proved Greek hoplites could not only survive against Persian infantry, but dominate them in close combat. The myth of Persian invincibility had been shattered on the beach at Marathon, but the battle wasn't over. As the surviving Persians fled to their ships, Datis made one final attempt to salvage the campaign. The Persian fleet still outnumbered any force the Greeks could muster at sea. If Athens was undefended, if the Athenian army was still at Marathon celebrating victory, perhaps the fleet could sail directly to Athens and take the city before the Greeks could react. It was a desperate gamble, but Datis had few options. Returning to Persia with nothing but casualties to report would mean disgrace, possibly execution. So the Persian fleet raised anchor and sailed south around Cape Sunion, racing toward Athens. But Miltiades understood Persian desperation. As soon as the last Persians were driven from the beach, he ordered his exhausted men to march. Immediately. No rest, no celebration, no time to properly care for the wounded or bury the dead. Athens was in danger. The march back was agony. The hoplites had just fought one of the most intense infantry battles in history. They were exhausted, dehydrated, wounded. Their armour felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The roughly 26-mile march from Marathon to Athens, much of it over mountainous terrain, would have taken 8 or 9 hours under normal circumstances. In their condition, pushing themselves beyond normal endurance, the Greeks made it in time. Barely. 2 Athenian tribes stayed at Marathon to guard the battlefield and care for the wounded. The other 8 tribes, roughly 8 or 9,000 men, force-marched back to Athens. They arrived at the sanctuary of Heracles at Cynosarges, on the outskirts of the city, just as the Persian fleet appeared off the coast. Datis had hoped to find Athens undefended. Instead, he saw the same Greek army that had destroyed his infantry at Marathon, now formed up and ready to fight again. The Persians rode at anchor for a few hours, perhaps hoping for a signal from sympathizers inside the city, perhaps just trying to decide if landing was worth the risk. Eventually they turned east and sailed for home. The invasion was over, Athens was saved, Greece was saved, Western civilization as we know it was saved. The day after the battle, the Spartan army finally arrived, about 2,000 of the finest warriors in Greece, men whose very name inspired terror throughout the Mediterranean. They had covered the distance from Sparta to Athens in just 3 days, an incredible feat of forced marching. But they were a day late. The battle had been won without them. The Spartans asked to see the battlefield and the Athenians obliged. Greek tradition held that the fallen should be buried in their home cities, but the Marathonomachoi, the Marathon fighters, were buried where they fell, a unique honour that acknowledged the battle's extraordinary significance. A great burial mound, the Sauros, was raised over the Athenian dead. It stands to this day. The Plataean dead received their own tomb nearby. The Persian casualties were left unburied on the beach. This was both a practical necessity, there were too many bodies to deal with, and a Greek gesture of respect. The Greeks believed that proper burial was essential for the soul's journey to the afterlife. By leaving the Persian dead unburied, initially at least, they were denying them peace. The Persians had a different tradition. They exposed their dead to the elements and scavenging birds, believing this was the natural order. So when the Athenians eventually buried the Persian bodies to prevent disease, the Persians might have been horrified rather than grateful. The strategic impact of Marathon was immediate. The Persian invasion had been stopped cold. Darius's plan to punish Athens and subjugate Greece had failed spectacularly. The Greeks had proven they could defeat the Persian military when led intelligently and fighting on favourable ground. The psychological impact was even more profound. Before Marathon, Persia seemed unstoppable, a force of nature that swept away all opposition. After Marathon, Greeks knew that Persians could bleed, that their armies could be beaten, that resistance wasn't futile. City-states that might have submitted to Persian demands now had reason to hope. The Greek world gained a decade to prepare for the next invasion everyone knew was coming, and it did come. Darius died in 486 BC while preparing a massive expedition to conquer Greece. His son Xerxes inherited both the throne and the obsession with Greek submission. In 480 BC, Xerxes launched the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever seen. Ancient sources claim millions of soldiers, which is obviously impossible, but modern estimates suggest 200,000 or more supported by hundreds of warships. This time Persia wouldn't be stopped at Marathon. The Greeks would have to defend every pass, every city, every inch of ground. But they had learned from Marathon. They knew Persian tactics. They understood that disciplined infantry in good positions could defeat numerically superior forces, and most importantly, they believed in victory. The Greek coalition that formed to resist Xerxes was inspired directly by Marathon. Sparta led the defence, but Athens provided the ships and the determination. At Thermopylae, 300 Spartans and several thousand other Greeks held a narrow mountain pass against the entire Persian army for 3 days, buying time for the Greek fleet to engage the Persian navy. At Salamis, the Athenian-led fleet destroyed Persian naval power in a single afternoon of close-quarters ramming and boarding actions. At Plataea, the combined Greek army crushed the Persian land forces, killing the Persian commander Mardonius and ending the invasion for good. None of these victories would have been possible without Marathon. Marathon proved that Greeks could win. Everything else followed from that. The legend of Marathon began immediately and has never stopped growing. The story of first Philippides running from Marathon to Athens to announce the victory, then collapsing dead from exhaustion, became one of the most famous tales in Western culture. Modern marathons, foot races of approximately 26 miles, commemorate this legendary run, though historians note that Herodotus never mentions it. The run Herodotus does describe is Pheidippides sprinting from Athens to Sparta before the battle, about 140 miles in 2 days, which is even more impressive but somehow less romantic. More likely, if anyone ran from Marathon to Athens with news of the victory, it was part of the army's desperate march to defend the city from the returning Persian fleet. The entire army ran in full armour because they had to, because Athens was in danger, because the battle wasn't truly over until the Persians sailed away. The cultural impact of Marathon cannot be overstated. The battle became the defining moment of Athenian identity, proof that their democracy could defend itself, that free citizens fighting for their own land were superior to the slaves and conscripts of Eastern despotism. The Athenians built monuments, painted murals, commissioned sculptures, wrote plays and poems and histories celebrating the victory. The painted colonnade in the Athenian agora, the Stoa Poikile, featured a massive mural of the battle painted by the artist Polygnotus. Citizens walking through the agora would see their ancestors crushing the Persian invaders, a daily reminder of Athens' finest hour. The playwright Aeschylus, who fought at Marathon, barely mentioned his literary achievements on his tomb. Instead, he wanted to be remembered as a Marathon fighter. That was the ultimate honour, nothing else compared. Marathon also validated the tactical principles of hoplite warfare that would dominate Greek military thinking for the next 2 centuries. The phalanx formation, with its emphasis on heavy infantry fighting shoulder to shoulder, became the standard model for Greek armies. The lesson seemed clear. Disciplined infantry with superior armour and longer spears could defeat more numerous but lightly equipped opponents. This would prove true against Persians, against barbarian tribes, even against other Greeks when city-states fought each other. Only the rise of Macedonian combined arms tactics, integrating cavalry and light infantry with the traditional phalanx, would eventually make the pure hoplite formation obsolete. But that was still a century and a half away. The tactical innovation that Miltiades displayed at Marathon, deliberately weakening the centre to strengthen the wings, became a textbook example studied by military commanders throughout antiquity. The double envelopment, attacking an enemy from multiple directions simultaneously, remains one of the most devastating tactical manoeuvres in warfare. Hannibal used it at Cannae to destroy a Roman army twice his size. Roman generals used it against barbarian tribes. Medieval commanders studied ancient accounts of Marathon and Cannae, trying to replicate the tactics. Modern military academies still teach the battle as an example of how inferior numbers can defeat a larger force through tactical creativity and understanding of terrain. For the Persians, Marathon was a humiliating disaster, but not a strategic catastrophe. They had lost a battle, not the war. The empire was vast enough to absorb the casualties without serious strain. But the blow to prestige was severe. Persian power rested partly on the belief that resistance was futile, that the great king's armies were invincible. Marathon proved otherwise. Rebellions that might have been deterred by fear of Persian revenge became thinkable. Satraps who might have remained loyal began calculating whether they could survive independence. The empire didn't collapse, but cracks appeared in its western frontier that would eventually widen into permanent loss of the Aegean region. What if Marathon had gone differently? What if the Persian centre had broken through before the Greek wings could complete the envelopment? What if Persian cavalry had been present on the battlefield? What if Datis had sailed directly to Athens instead of landing at Marathon? These counterfactual questions are impossible to answer definitively, but they're worth considering because they highlight how contingent the battle's outcome was. A few tactical decisions going differently, a few moments of panic instead of discipline, and the Greek line might have collapsed. Athens would have fallen. Sparta might have submitted rather than face the full weight of Persian power alone. Greece would have been incorporated into the Persian Empire, another collection of satrapies paying tribute to the great king, and if Greece had fallen, Western civilization as we understand it might not exist. Greek philosophy, with its emphasis on rational inquiry and logical argument, might have been replaced by Persian religious traditions. Democracy, barely a generation old in Athens, would have been strangled in its cradle, replaced by tyranny backed by Persian power. The Greek Golden Age, the explosion of art and literature and architecture and mathematics and science that followed the Persian Wars, would never have happened. No Parthenon, no Socrates, no Plato, no Aristotle. The intellectual foundations of Western thought would have been radically different, or absent entirely. This isn't to say that Persian culture was inferior. The Achaemenid Empire produced remarkable achievements in administration, architecture, art and engineering. But it was fundamentally different from Greek culture, and Greek culture, for better and worse, became the template for Western civilization. Marathon ensured that templates survived. The Battle of Marathon was won by ordinary men doing extraordinary things. They were citizen soldiers, not professional warriors. They had families and farms and businesses waiting for them back in Athens. They had every reason to be terrified facing the Persian army, every excuse to retreat or surrender, or hope someone else would do the fighting. But they stood their ground. They followed Miltiades into a brutal, terrifying infantry battle against overwhelming numbers. They held the centre even as it collapsed around them. They wheeled their wings inward with precision. They pursued fleeing Persians across a beach slippery with blood, and then they marched for 8 hours in full armour to save their city from a second attack. Their courage bought Greece time. Their discipline proved that Greek tactics could work. Their victory changed history. Among those hoplites on the Marathon plain were men whose names we still know. Callimachus, the polemarch who broke the deadlock and voted for battle, who fought in the front ranks and died there, taking multiple wounds before finally falling. Aristides the Just, one of Athens' leading statesmen, who commanded the troops that stayed to guard the battlefield while the rest marched back to Athens. Themistocles, the future architect of Greek naval power, who would persuade Athens to build the fleet that destroyed the Persians at Salamis a decade later. And Aeschylus, the playwright, whose tragedies would explore themes of hubris and fate and the price of violence. These men lived with the memory of Marathon for the rest of their lives. They had seen the Persian army up close, they knew what war truly meant, and they carried those scars into Athens' golden age. The plain of Marathon today is peaceful. Olive trees and farms cover the ancient battlefield. The burial mound of the Athenian dead, the Soros, rises from the fields, a limestone reminder of the men who fell there. Archaeologists have excavated parts of the battlefield, finding arrow points and spear tips and fragments of armour. Tourists come to stand where the phalanx formed, where the charge began, where Greek and Persian collided in a clash that echoed through centuries. On the beach where Persians fled to their ships, the waves roll in as they always have, washing away the last traces of blood and violence. Time has erased the battlefield, but the memory remains. In Athens, Marathon became legend almost immediately. Survivors told their stories to anyone who would listen. Artists painted the battle. Sculptors carved monuments. Poets composed verses celebrating the victory. Within a generation, Marathon had transformed from history into myth. A perfect moment when everything went right, when ordinary citizens became heroes, when democracy proved its worth. The Athenians who voted in the assembly, who debated philosophy in the agora, who watched tragedies in the theatre, understood that their freedom had been won on that coastal plain. They owed their civilization to the men who stood at Marathon, and they never forgot. When you run a modern marathon, when you push yourself through those 26.2 miles of exhaustion and pain and determination, you're commemorating something that may or may not have happened, a runner who may or may not have collapsed after announcing victory. But you're also commemorating something that definitely did happen. 11,000 men marching in bronze armour through the Athenian hills, racing against time to save their city. Men who had just won the most important battle of their lives and couldn't rest because the war wasn't over. That's the real marathon. Not one runner dying dramatically. 8,000 hoplites forcing their broken bodies to move because their families needed them, because Athens needed them, because giving up meant everything they just fought for would be lost. That's the endurance worth. Celebrating. That's the legacy of marathon. September 490 BC, 26 miles northeast of Athens. The sun set over the Marathon plain on a battlefield littered with the dead. The Persian fleet disappeared over the horizon, sailing east toward Asia, carrying the survivors of a failed invasion. In Athens, citizens stood on the walls, watching their army march home, bronze armour glinting in the late afternoon sun. They had won. Against all odds, against overwhelming force, against an empire that had conquered the known world, they had won. The Persians could bleed. The Persians could be beaten. Greece would survive. Democracy would survive. And 25 centuries later, we're still telling the story of how 11,000 Greeks stood on a coastal plain and changed the course of civilization. That's marathon. That's why it matters. And that's why we remember the men who fought there, who proved that free people defending their homes are the most dangerous warriors the world has ever seen. The immediate aftermath of Marathon was chaos mixed with euphoria. As the Athenian hoplites stood in formation outside Athens, watching the Persian fleet finally turn away and sail east, the full weight of what they'd accomplished began to sink in. They had faced the greatest empire on earth and won. Not through luck, not through divine intervention alone, though they certainly thanked the gods, but through their own courage and discipline and willingness to risk everything for their city. The exhausted soldiers finally broke ranks and stumbled into Athens, where citizens poured into the streets to embrace them, to touch their armour, to hear the stories of the battle. Mothers searched desperately for sons, wives looked for husbands, the fortunate found their loved ones alive, blooded but breathing. Others learned that their men lay dead on the Marathon plain, buried in the great mound with their comrades. The political fallout in Athens was immediate and profound. Miltiades, the general who had argued for confronting the Persians at Marathon, became the most celebrated man in the city. His tactical genius had saved Athens. His understanding of Persian warfare had given the Greeks their victory. He was showered with honours, praised in the assembly, lionised by the citizens. But success in Athens was always temporary, always subject to the city's democratic volatility. Within a year, Miltiades would lead a disastrous expedition against the island of Paros, suffer a serious wound, be prosecuted for his failure, and die in prison. Athens gave glory quickly and took it away just as fast. But on those first days after Marathon, Miltiades was untouchable, the saviour of the city, the man who had proven that Athens could defend itself. The funeral for the 192 Athenian dead was one of the most elaborate the city had ever held. Normally, war dead were brought back to Athens for burial in the public cemetery, the Kerameikos, but the Marathonomachoi were different. They were buried where they fell, at Marathon, in recognition that this battle was unlike any other. The great burial mound was raised over their remains, with each man's name recorded on stone. For Athenians, the Soros became a pilgrimage site, a place where citizens could go to remember the moment their city had stood against impossible odds and survived. Fathers brought sons to the mound to teach them about courage and sacrifice. Veterans came to honour fallen comrades. The mound was more than a tomb. It was a monument to everything Athens believed about itself. The 1,000 Plataeans who had fought alongside Athens received honours of their own. Their decision to march to Marathon, where no other city would help Athens, created a bond between the two cities that lasted for generations. Athens granted the Plataeans special privileges, allowing them to participate in certain religious festivals, normally restricted to Athenian citizens. When Plataea was later destroyed by Sparta during the Peloponnesian War, Athens offered refuge to the survivors. The debt incurred at Marathon was never forgotten. In a world where alliances shifted constantly, where cities betrayed each other routinely, where self-interest always trumped loyalty, Plataea's gesture at Marathon stood out as something rare and precious. They had come when Athens needed them most. Athens remembered. In Persia, the news of Marathon landed like a thunderbolt. Darius had sent his expedition to punish Athens and establish Persian dominance over Greece. Instead, his army had been humiliated by a collection of amateur soldiers defending their homeland. The great king was furious. According to Herodotus, he began preparing an even larger expedition to Greece, one that would overwhelm all resistance through sheer force of numbers. But Darius never got his revenge. Egypt rebelled in 486 BC, requiring immediate attention. Darius died later that year while preparing to deal with both rebellions. His son Xerxes inherited an empire in turmoil and a father's obsession with Greek submission. But Xerxes had to secure his position first, crush the Egyptian revolt, stabilize the eastern frontiers. Greece would have to wait. That delay gave Athens 10 years to prepare, 10 years to build the naval power that would save Greece at Salamis. Marathon bought time, and that time proved invaluable. The Spartan reaction to Marathon was complex. On one hand, they respected the Athenian achievement. The Spartans were professional warriors who understood how difficult it was to defeat a numerically superior enemy in open battle. The Athenians had accomplished something impressive. On the other hand, Sparta was deeply invested in maintaining its position as Greece's premier military power. The idea that Athens, with its democracy and its merchant culture, and its lack of military tradition, had defeated the Persians without Spartan help was unsettling. Some Spartans grumbled that if they had arrived on time, the victory would have been even more decisive, that Athenian casualties would have been lower. Others pointed out that the Athenians had managed quite well on their own, thank you very much. The tension between Athens and Sparta, between democratic innovation and conservative militarism, between naval power and land power, would eventually tear Greece apart in the Peloponnesian War. But at Marathon, before the rivalry became toxic, the two cities were still allies against a common enemy. The broader Greek world absorbed the lessons of Marathon slowly and unevenly. Some cities saw the battle as proof that resistance to Persia was possible. Others viewed it as a fluke, a lucky victory that wouldn't be repeated. Many Greek city-states in Asia Minor living under Persian rule heard about Marathon and dared to hope that liberation might be possible. Others, particularly in northern Greece where Persian power was closer and more threatening, decided that submission was still the safer option. Marathon didn't unite Greece. Nothing could unite Greece for long, but it did plant a seed of resistance that would bloom when Xerxes invaded a decade later. Cities that might have opened their gates to Persian demands instead chose to fight. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough to matter. Enough to give the Greek coalition a fighting chance. The tactical lessons of Marathon were studied and debated for generations. Greek military thinkers analysed Miltiades' decision to weaken the centre and strengthen the wings. Some praised it as brilliant improvisation under impossible circumstances. Others criticised it as recklessly gambling with the lives of the entire army. What if the centre had broken 5 minutes earlier? What if the wings hadn't been able to complete the envelopment in time? The plan worked, but it could have failed catastrophically. Miltiades had taken an enormous risk, but that was the nature of command. Sometimes you had to gamble. Sometimes the only safe option was to take no action at all, and that was really just another way of losing. Miltiades had understood that waiting for the Spartans might mean Athens would fall before help arrived. He had understood that fighting the Persians in the open, where their cavalry could dominate, meant certain defeat. So he had attacked at Marathon, on ground that favoured Greek infantry, using tactics that maximised Greek advantages while minimising Persian strengths. It was audacious and risky and brilliant, and it worked. The weakening of the centre in particular became a subject of intense military debate. Traditional Greek tactics called for uniform phalanx depth throughout the line. The idea was to present an unbreakable wall of bronze and iron that could grind through enemy formations through sheer weight and momentum. Miltiades had violated this principle, deliberately creating a weak point in his own line. He had turned his formation into a trap, baiting the Persians into attacking the centre while the wings closed in from both sides. It was a precursor to Hannibal's tactics at Cannae, and military historians have debated ever since whether Hannibal learned from Marathon or developed his tactics independently. Either way, Both battles demonstrated the same principle. A disciplined army with good commanders could use apparent weakness to create devastating strength. You could sacrifice the centre to destroy the flanks, then use the victorious flanks to crush the enemy centre. It required precise timing, absolute discipline, and troops who wouldn't panic when their line started bending backward. The Athenians at Marathon had all three. The religious dimension of Marathon was equally important to the Greeks. The Athenians believed that the gods had favoured them in battle, that divine intervention had contributed to their victory. Before the battle, the Athenians had prayed to Pan, the wild god of shepherds and goatherds, after Pheidippides claimed to have encountered the deity during his run to Sparta. Pan had supposedly promised to help Athens if the city honoured him properly. After the victory, the Athenians built a sanctuary to Pan on the Acropolis and instituted annual torch races in his honour. They also attributed their victory to Athena, the city's patron goddess, who had surely guided their spears and shielded them from Persian arrows. A portion of the Persian spoils was dedicated to the goddess, melted down and recast as a massive bronze statue that stood on the Acropolis for centuries. The religious and the practical were inseparable in Greek thought. Yes, they had won through superior tactics and discipline and armour, but the gods had also been on their side. Both things were true. The Athenians also claimed supernatural assistance during the battle itself. According to later accounts, witnesses saw the hero Theseus, Athens' legendary king, fighting in the front ranks alongside living soldiers. Others claimed to see Marathon, the local hero for whom the plain was named, inspiring the troops. A warrior named Epizelus reported that he had gone blind during the battle after seeing a massive ghostly figure fighting nearby, a giant with a huge beard whose shadow fell across the entire battlefield. Modern historians dismiss these accounts as propaganda or psychological trauma manifested as religious vision. But to the Greeks, these stories were evidence of divine favour. The gods and heroes had fought for Athens at Marathon. The victory was therefore not just military but cosmic. Athens was the righteous defender. Persia was the impious aggressor. The gods had pronounced judgment on the beach at Marathon. One of the most significant long-term impacts of Marathon was how it shaped Athenian identity and democratic ideology. Before Marathon, Athenian democracy was barely 20 years old, a radical experiment that could have collapsed at any moment. The city was plagued by internal divisions between aristocrats who resented, losing political power, and common citizens who feared tyranny might return. Marathon changed everything. The hoplites who won the battle were citizen soldiers, ordinary men who had armed themselves and marched to defend their city. They hadn't waited for aristocratic cavalry or professional mercenaries or foreign allies. They had taken responsibility for their own defence, and they had won. Democracy had defended itself. The citizens had proven they were capable of military excellence, that they didn't need kings or tyrants or oligarchs to protect them. This became the foundation of Athens' democratic self-image for generations. Free citizens fighting for their own land were superior to slaves, and subjects fighting for their masters. Marathon was the proof. This ideology would shape Athenian policy for the rest of the 5th century. When Athens built its massive fleet after Marathon, it manned those ships with thousands of poor citizens who couldn't afford hoplite armour but could pull an oar. These thetes, the lowest economic class, became essential to Athenian military power, and because they were essential to the military, they demanded political rights. If you fought for Athens, you deserved a voice in Athens' government. Marathon had established this principle. The democratic reforms that followed, expanding citizenship rights and redistributing political power away from the aristocracy, all flowed from the basic insight that citizens who defend the city should control the city. Marathon didn't create Athenian democracy, but it validated it, proved it could work, gave it the legitimacy to expand and deepen and become the model that inspired Democrats for the next 2,500 years. The economic impact of Marathon was also significant. The Persian expedition had brought enormous wealth across the Aegean. When the Persian army fled, they left behind vast quantities of equipment, supplies, and treasure. The Athenians captured ships loaded with provisions, armour, weapons, gold and silver intended to finance the campaign. All of this became war booty, divided among the victorious soldiers and the city itself. Suddenly, Athens had resources it had never possessed before. Some of the treasure went to religious dedications, thanking the gods for victory. Some went to public works, improving the city's infrastructure. Some was distributed to the citizens, a tangible reward for their courage at Marathon. And some was used to begin building the fleet that would eventually make Athens the dominant naval power in the Mediterranean. Marathon's military victory created the economic foundation for Athens' golden age. The city also benefited from the boost to its international prestige. Before Marathon, Athens was just another Greek city-state, neither the largest nor the richest nor the most powerful. After Marathon, Athens was the city that had defeated Persia, the defender of Greek freedom, the champion of democracy against despotism. Greek cities that had previously ignored Athenian overtures now sought alliances. Trade relationships expanded. Talented individuals from across the Greek world migrated to Athens, attracted by the city's growing reputation and economic opportunities. Within a generation, Athens would be producing some of the greatest art, architecture, literature, and philosophy in human history. Marathon didn't cause the Golden Age directly, but it created the conditions that made the Golden Age possible. The psychological impact on individual Athenians was profound. The men who fought at Marathon carried that experience for the rest of their lives. They had faced death and survived. They had seen friends cut down beside them. They had killed enemy soldiers with their own hands, felt spears punching through flesh, seen blood spray across armour, heard the screams of dying men. Combat in the ancient world was intimate and brutal. There was no distance, no artillery, no firearms allowing you to kill without seeing your enemy's face. You fought within arm's reach, close enough to smell sweat and fear and blood, close enough to see terror in your opponent's eyes as your spear found his belly. The Marathon of McCoy had done this and lived. They had killed Persians by the dozens, and they had come home to wives and children and farms and workshops, expected to resume normal life as if nothing had happened. Some managed, others struggled. The Greeks didn't have words for post-traumatic stress or combat trauma, but they understood that war changed men, that soldiers returned from battle different than when they left. Aeschylus, the playwright who fought at Marathon, channeled his experiences into his tragedies. His play The Persians, performed in 472 BC, 8 years after Marathon, depicted the Persian court receiving news of their defeat at Salamis. But the themes, the horror of war, the grief of mothers and wives, the price of hubris, the randomness of survival, all came from Marathon. Aeschylus had seen empire shatter on the beach. He had participated in the killing. He had stood in formation while men around him fell. His plays explored what that meant, what it cost, why men did it anyway. He never glorified war in his tragedies. He showed it honestly, as something terrible and necessary, something that destroyed even as it preserved. That was the Marathon veteran's perspective. Yes, we won. Yes, we had to fight. But victory came at a price that will never stop paying. The decade between Marathon and the next Persian invasion was one of frenetic preparation in Athens. Themistocles, who had fought at Marathon and understood that the Persians would return, became the dominant political figure in the city. He convinced the Athenians to use revenue from newly discovered silver mines at Laurium to build a massive fleet rather than distribute the money among the citizens. It was a hard sell. Many Athenians wanted the immediate benefit of cash in hand. Themistocles argued that ships would save the city when the Persians returned. He was right. By 480 BC, Athens had 200 triremes, more than any other Greek city. That fleet would prove decisive at Salamis, destroying Persian naval power and forcing Xerxes to retreat. Marathon bought Athens time to build that fleet. Without Marathon's victory, without the decade of preparation it enabled, Athens might not have survived Xerxes' invasion. When Xerxes finally launched his invasion in 480 BC, it dwarfed the expedition that had been defeated at Marathon. Ancient sources claim millions of soldiers, which is impossible, but even conservative modern estimates suggest forces numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The Persian army marched overland through Thrace and Macedonia, crossed into Greece at Thermopylae, and headed for Athens. The Persian navy, numbering perhaps 600 to 800 warships, sailed down the coast in parallel. This time, the Greeks couldn't meet the Persians at a single beach and drive them away. This time, they needed a coalition, multiple armies coordinating defence, a fleet to challenge Persian naval supremacy. Marathon had bought time for that coalition to form. At Thermopylae, a small Greek force led by Spartan king Leonidas held a narrow mountain pass against the entire Persian army for 3 days. 300 Spartans, forming the core of the defensive position, became legendary for their stand. They bought time for the Greek fleet to engage the Persians at Artemisium. They showed that Greeks could hold even against overwhelming numbers if they chose their terrain wisely. And when they finally fell, betrayed by a local guide who showed the Persians a path around the pass, they demonstrated the price of Greek freedom. Thermopylae was a defeat, but it was a defeat that inspired the rest of Greece to fight harder. The Spartans had proven that resistance was possible, that Greek valour could match Persian numbers, that death in defence of freedom was glorious. Marathon had taught the same lesson. Thermopylae reinforced it. At Salamis, the Athenian-led Greek fleet annihilated the Persian navy in the narrow waters between the island and the mainland. Themistocles lured the Persian fleet into a confined space where Greek triremes, heavier and more manoeuvrable at close quarters, could ram and board the Persian ships. The Persians lost hundreds of warships in a single afternoon. Xerxes, watching from a throne placed on the shore, saw his naval power destroyed. Without naval supremacy, he couldn't supply his massive army occupying Greece. He retreated to Asia, leaving behind a large force under Mardonius to continue the campaign. But the momentum had shifted. The Greeks had proven they could defeat Persian forces on land at Marathon and at sea at Salamis. Persian invincibility was a myth, and everyone knew it. The final blow came at Plataea in 479 BC, where a united Greek army destroyed the remaining Persian forces in Greece. The Greeks, using tactics refined after Marathon and Thermopylae, held their phalanx formation against repeated Persian attacks. When the Persian line finally broke, the Greeks pursued ruthlessly, killing thousands. Mardonius himself died in the fighting. The Persian threat to mainland Greece was over. The Greeks had not only defended their land, but proven that their military system, citizen soldiers fighting in disciplined formations, was superior to the Persian model of conscript armies serving a divine king. Marathon had been the first proof. Plataea was the confirmation. In the decades after the Persian Wars, Athens grew into the most powerful city in Greece. The Delian League, originally formed as a defensive alliance against Persia, gradually transformed into an Athenian empire. Athens used its navy to dominate the Aegean, extracting tribute from allied cities, suppressing resistance, imposing democratic governments on oligarchic states. The empire was built on naval power, which traced back to Themistocles' decision to build the fleet after Marathon. Marathon's victory had given Athens the confidence, the resources, and the breathing room to become a superpower. The irony was bitter. Athens had fought at Marathon to preserve its freedom from foreign domination. Within 50 years, Athens was dominating other Greek cities, imposing its will on supposedly free allies. Power corrupted, even democratic power, maybe especially democratic power. The artistic and intellectual explosion that we call the Athenian Golden Age was directly connected to Marathon and its aftermath. The generation that came of age after Marathon, born around the time of the battle or shortly after, produced Pericles, the statesman who led Athens during its cultural peak. Sophocles and Euripides, who refined Greek tragedy into its highest form. Herodotus, who wrote the first true history, making Marathon and the Persian Wars his central subject. Socrates, who revolutionized philosophy and got himself executed for asking too many uncomfortable questions. These men grew up in an Athens transformed by Marathon, confident in its democracy, proud of its military achievements, wealthy from empire, open to new ideas and foreign influences. Marathon didn't create these geniuses, but it created the environment where genius could flourish. The Parthenon, the magnificent temple to Athena that still dominates the Athenian Acropolis, was built with funds from the Delian League, essentially tribute extracted from Athens' subject allies. It was a monument to Athenian power and culture, yes, but also to Athenian imperialism. The funds could have been used to strengthen defences against Persia, the League's supposed purpose. Instead, Athens used them for glory, and the Parthenon was glorious. It represented everything Athens believed about itself after Marathon. They were the defenders of Greece. They had earned the right to lead. Their gods favoured them. Their democracy was superior. Their culture was worth celebrating in marble and gold. Marathon made the Parthenon possible, for better and worse. The memory of Marathon was carefully cultivated and manipulated by later generations of Athenians. As the city's power grew, as it engaged in wars against other Greeks, as its democracy became more radical and its empire more oppressive, Politicians invoked Marathon to justify their actions. "We are the city that defeated Persia," they argued. "We deserve to lead Greece. Our sacrifices at Marathon earned us this position. Anyone who opposes us opposes Greek freedom itself." It was effective propaganda, but it was also deeply hypocritical. The men who fought at Marathon had defended Athenian independence. Their descendants used that memory to justify destroying the independence of other Greek cities. The Marathon veterans, had they lived to see Athens' empire, might not have recognized what their victory had created. The Peloponnesian War, which began in 431 BC and eventually destroyed Athens' empire, was in many ways a consequence of Marathon's success. Athens had grown so powerful, so confident, so aggressive in its imperialism that Sparta and its allies felt threatened. The war lasted 27 years, devastated Greece, killed tens of thousands, and ended with Athens' complete defeat. The democracy that Marathon had saved was briefly overthrown by oligarchic coups. The fleet that Themistocles had built was surrendered to Sparta. The empire was dismantled. Athens survived as a city but never regained its power. The irony was profound. Marathon had saved Athens from Persian domination, but the power and confidence that victory generated eventually led to conflicts that destroyed Athenian greatness. Victory had planted the seeds of future defeat. In the 4th century, as Athens struggled to rebuild after the Peloponnesian War, Marathon became even more important to Athenian identity. The city had lost its empire, its fleet, its political dominance, but it still had its history. It still had Marathon. Orators speaking in the assembly invoked the Marathon fighters as exemplars of Athenian virtue. "Remember what we once were," they argued. "Remember when Athens stood against the Persian Empire and won. We can reclaim that greatness. We can be worthy of our ancestors." It was inspiring rhetoric, but it was also nostalgia, looking backward instead of forward, using past glory to mask present mediocrity. Marathon had become a myth, a golden age that could never be recreated because it had never really existed, not in the perfect form that later Athenians imagined. When Philip of Macedon began conquering the Greek city-states in the mid-4th century, some Athenians argued for resistance, invoking Marathon as proof that Greeks could defeat larger empires. But Philip wasn't Darius. Macedonia wasn't Persia. Philip commanded a professional army using combined arms tactics that made traditional Greek hoplite warfare obsolete. His son Alexander would conquer the Persian Empire itself, achieving what Marathon had prevented Persia from achieving in Greece. Alexander admired Athens, visited the city, made offerings at the temples, but he also took hostages to ensure Athenian cooperation. Athens was no longer a power that could stand against empires. It was a subject, albeit an honoured one, of the Macedonian hegemony. Marathon's legacy lived on in memory and myth, but not in political reality. The Romans, when they eventually conquered Greece, were fascinated by Marathon. Roman military writers studied the battle, trying to understand how a smaller force had defeated a larger one through tactical innovation. Roman politicians invoked Marathon as an example of republican virtue triumphing over Oriental despotism, comparing Rome's battles against Carthage to Athens' stand against Persia. The comparison was self-serving and not entirely accurate, but it served Rome's ideological purposes. Rome was the new Athens, defender of civilization against barbarians. This rhetoric helped justify Roman imperialism while appealing to Greek cultural prestige. The Romans conquered Greece militarily, but submitted to Greek culture intellectually. And Marathon was part of that cultural package, a story that reinforced the values Rome wanted to project. In the centuries after Rome fell, Marathon was largely forgotten in Western Europe. The classical texts that preserved the story survived in monasteries and libraries, but few people read them. The Byzantine Empire, heir to Rome in the east, maintained some knowledge of Marathon as part of its Greek heritage, but the battle had no immediate relevance to medieval warfare, which was dominated by heavy cavalry and castle sieges, not infantry phalanxes. Marathon slept in historical memory, waiting for someone to wake it up. The Renaissance changed everything. As European scholars rediscovered classical texts, they found Herodotus' account of Marathon and were captivated. Here was a story of freedom versus tyranny, democracy versus despotism, West versus East. It fit perfectly with Renaissance humanism's idealization of classical civilization. Marathon became a symbol of what Europe imagined itself to be, the heir to Greek and Roman glory, defender of liberty against Asiatic absolutism. The fact that this narrative was oversimplified and often racist didn't matter. It was useful. It justified European expansionism while celebrating European values. Marathon was recruited into ideological service once again, this time for modern European empires. The 18th century Enlightenment embraced Marathon even more enthusiastically. Philosophers arguing for democracy and against absolute monarchy pointed to Marathon as proof that free citizens made better soldiers than subjects of a king. The Athenians had defeated the Persians because they fought for themselves, not for a tyrant. This became a powerful argument in debates about political reform. If democracy had saved Athens at Marathon, perhaps democracy could improve modern nations. American revolutionaries certainly thought so. When they declared independence from Britain and fought to establish a democratic republic, they invoked Marathon repeatedly. They were modern Athens, fighting against British tyranny just as the Athenians had fought Persian despotism. The comparison was imperfect, but it was inspiring. The 19th century saw Marathon become part of popular culture through the modern Olympic Games. When the Olympics were revived in Athens in 1896, organisers wanted an event that would connect the modern games to ancient Greek glory. Someone suggested a long-distance race from Marathon to Athens, commemorating Pheidippides' legendary run. The marathon race was born, though based on a story that probably never happened the way Herodotus described it. But historical accuracy mattered less than symbolic resonance. Running 26 miles represented the endurance and sacrifice of the marathon fighters. It celebrated Greek heritage. It gave the Olympics a direct link to the Persian Wars. The marathon became one of the most prestigious Olympic events, and every runner who completes one participates, however unknowingly, in marathon's legacy. The 20th century brought new interpretations of marathon as historians developed more sophisticated analytical tools. Scholars began questioning ancient sources, pointing out inconsistencies in Herodotus, acknowledging that casualty figures were probably exaggerated, recognizing that Greek accounts of the Persian Wars were propaganda as much as history. This didn't diminish Marathon's significance, but it complicated our understanding. We can't know exactly what happened on that beach in 490 BC. We have one main source, written decades after the battle by someone who wasn't there, based on testimonies that were undoubtedly biased. Everything else is inference and speculation. But even if we can't reconstruct every tactical detail, we can be certain that something extraordinary happened. The Persians invaded. The Athenians fought them at Marathon. The Persians were defeated and withdrew. That core narrative is historically solid, even if the details remain debatable. Modern military historians have used Marathon to explore broader questions about what makes armies effective. Was it equipment? The Greek hoplites certainly had superior armour and longer spears. Was it training? The Persians were professionals, but the Greeks had discipline and cohesion that came from fighting alongside neighbours and fellow citizens. Was it motivation? The Greeks were defending their homes, while many Persians were conscripts fighting for an empire that offered them little personal benefit. Probably all of these factors mattered, plus tactical brilliance from Miltiades, plus terrain that favoured Greek infantry, plus perhaps the absence of Persian cavalry on the battlefield, plus dozens of other variables we can't measure. Marathon reminds us that military success rarely has a single cause. It's always a combination of material factors, human decisions, training and preparation, morale and motivation, and sometimes just luck. The archaeological evidence from Marathon, while limited, has provided some fascinating insights. Excavations have uncovered arrowheads, spear points, and armour fragments from the battle. The burial mound, the Soros, has been studied extensively, confirming that it contains the remains of numerous individuals buried in a mass grave. Some scholars have used forensic analysis to understand the types of injuries the dead sustained, providing evidence about how the battle was fought. Most wounds were to the front of the body, suggesting soldiers died facing the enemy rather than fleeing. Skull fractures indicate close quarters fighting where men use shields and sword pommels as bludgeons when spears broke. Shattered bones show the force of impacts from heavy weapons. The archaeology doesn't contradict Herodotus' account, but adds layers of detail he couldn't have known or didn't think worth mentioning. One of the most interesting modern debates about Marathon concerns the Persian strategy. Why did Datis land at Marathon in the first place? Why not sail directly to Athens? The traditional explanation, That Hippias recommended Marathon as a good landing site with open ground for cavalry makes sense. But some historians have suggested that the Persian plan was actually more sophisticated. Perhaps Datis intended to lure the Athenian army out of the city, pin them at Marathon, then send part of his fleet to Athens while the Athenians were occupied. This would explain why the Persians didn't immediately attack when the Greeks arrived. They were waiting for the Athenians to commit fully before springing the trap. If this theory is correct, then Miltiades' decision to attack quickly disrupted Persian plans, forcing Datis to fight at Marathon instead of executing a more complex two-pronged strategy. We'll never know for certain, but it's a reminder that the Persians weren't incompetent. They were skilled strategists who had conquered half the world. They lost at Marathon not because they were stupid, but because the Greeks outfought and outthought them on that specific day. Marathon's influence on Western military thought has been enormous. The idea that defensive wars fought for freedom produce superior soldiers has been invoked in virtually every conflict since. Sometimes it's true, sometimes it's propaganda. But the Marathon model, that free citizens defending their homes make the best warriors, has shaped military and political thinking for 25 centuries. American revolutionaries cited it. French revolutionaries cited it. Every independence movement and national liberation struggle has invoked some version of the Marathon narrative. We are the underdog fighting against empire. We are defending our freedom. We will win because our cause is just. Sometimes these claims are genuine. Sometimes they're cynical manipulation. But the Marathon template, small force of free citizens defeats large empire through courage and tactical brilliance, has proven endlessly adaptable to different historical contexts. The moral lessons drawn from Marathon have been equally varied. Some see it as proof that democracy produces superior military outcomes, that free societies will always defeat authoritarian ones given enough time and resources. Others argue it shows the importance of individual genius, that Miltiades' tactical brilliance mattered more than political systems. Still others focus on the role of fortune, noting that small changes in circumstances might have produced a Persian victory. Marathon can support almost any interpretation you want to impose on it. That's part of why the battle has remained culturally relevant for so long. It's complex enough to resist simple explanations, rich enough to generate continued debate, important enough that people care about the answers. For the modern Greek nation, Marathon occupies a special place. When Greece won independence from the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, nationalists looked to the ancient past for inspiration and legitimacy. Marathon was perfect. It represented Greek resistance to foreign domination, Greek military prowess, Greek love of freedom, the fact that modern Greeks are not direct descendants of ancient Athenians, that Greek identity has changed dramatically over 2,500 years, that the modern Greek nation encompasses regions that didn't exist or weren't Greek in the 5th century BC, none of that mattered. Marathon became part of modern Greek national mythology, a founding moment that connected contemporary Greece to its glorious past. Every Greek schoolchild learns about Marathon. The battlefield is a national shrine. The burial mound is protected as a historic site. Marathon is woven into how Greeks understand themselves. The plain of Marathon today is quiet, agricultural, surrounded by low mountains and bordered by the sea. Tourists visit the archaeological sites, stand at the burial mound, try to imagine the battle. Local guides point out where the Greek wings probably stood, where the Persian centre pushed forward, where the final clash on the beach took place. But it requires imagination. The landscape has changed. Millennia of erosion and farming have altered the terrain. The ancient beach is probably not where the modern beach sits. The swamps that protected the Greek flanks have been drained. What visitors see is a peaceful plain where olives grow and tourists take photos, not a killing ground soaked in blood. That's probably for the better. The violence happened, the men died, but life moved on. The plain returned to productive use. That's its own kind of victory. In our own time, Marathon continues to resonate. We live in an era of democratic crisis, where authoritarian powers challenge liberal democracies, where questions about freedom versus security, openness versus nationalism, internationalism versus isolationism dominate political debate. Marathon speaks to these concerns. It reminds us that democracy has always had to defend itself, that freedom is never guaranteed, that small nations can resist empires if they have the will and the tactical intelligence to do so. Whether that's a useful lesson or dangerous nostalgia depends on your perspective. But Marathon remains relevant because the questions it raises, about how free societies defend themselves, about whether democracy makes stronger militaries, about how citizens should balance individual rights against collective security. These questions haven't been answered. They're eternal human questions. Marathon is one attempt at an answer. The men who stood on the Marathon plain in September 490 BC didn't know they were making history. They knew they were scared. They knew their city needed them. They knew they might die. They stood in formation because their neighbours stood beside them, because running meant abandoning their families to Persian revenge, because the alternative to fighting was slavery or death. They fought because they had to. The fact that their fight became legendary, that their sacrifice inspired countless others, that their victory changed the course of civilization, all of that came later. In the moment, they were just men with spears and shields trying to survive, trying to protect Athens, trying to stop an empire that seemed unstoppable. They succeeded. That's what we remember. That's what Marathon means. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things because the moment demands it. That's the real legacy, more important than tactical innovations or casualty counts or geopolitical consequences. Marathon proved that courage matters, that citizens defending their homes are formidable, that David can beat Goliath if David is smart and brave and incredibly lucky. 2,500 years later, we still need that reminder. We still need Marathon.